The Bible pays no attention to race. Period. Thank you for listening. This will shock many, especially those who are now pointing to the heavenly church at the favorite verse today, Revelation 7:9, that supposedly highlights diverse races. After this I looked, John says, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation and from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands. Now it's true that this great multitude will be of many colors, but this passage pays no attention to their colors. Instead, the author of Revelation focuses on their nations and tribes and peoples and languages. Now nations, the Greek, ta ethne. In the biblical world, nations were composed of people with different skin colors. A nation was united by its culture, which was formed by its cultus, or religion. Now, Israel was a nation united by Jewish religion. Its people were a mixed multitude with different colors from Exodus days. The people of Israel had often assimilated people from other nations like Ruth and Rahab, who were probably of slightly different colors. This is the first tip-off that the Bible identifies people not by their pigment, but by their national cultures. Tribes, phule is the Greek, were family lines of common descent. Just as families today where spouses and adopted children can have different colors, so too tribes were often made up in the ancient world of people of different colors. In this case, identity in the Bible comes from kin relationships, not skin colors. Peoples, laoi in the Greek, were groups with a common history and constitution. They often consisted of those in the region of a nation, such as the people of Galilee in the larger people of Judea, the larger nation of Judea, or the people of Macedonia or Achaia in what we now know as Greece. Because of migration and intermarriage, they often were of different colors, but they were identified by their people groups, not by their colors. Once more we see identity comes from membership in a people group rather than skin pigment. Tongues, glosse in the Greek, were different dialects and languages. Jews in the Bible had their own linguistic differences. In Judges 12, remember, the tribes on the west side of the Jordan became known to the Gileadites on the east side by their inability to pronounce shibboleth. Just as Peter was recognized as a friend of Jesus the Galilean by his Galilean accent. At Pentecost, the crowds of Jews from all over the Mediterranean world spoke different tongues and could not understand one another, and surely were of different colors because they came from different nations all over the Mediterranean world. They were all Jews. Their skins had different colors, but the biblical author took no notice of their pigments, only their different tongues and nations of residence. These are the variations in creation identity which the Bible says God intended. Paul told the pagan philosophers on Mars Hill that God determined the allotted periods and boundaries of the dwelling places of his beloved human creatures. He decided which times in history and which cultures he would have men and women like you inhabit. Those times and cultures and nations and families and tribes and languages gave creation identity to those millions, billions of men and women through history. They were of many different colors, but the Bible says not a word about those colors. Other dimensions of the creation were more determinative, deeper, more determinative of identity. What is true for human beings outside the church is also true for those in the church. The Bible describes the church as diverse, but with a diversity that ignores skin color. It's a diversity of sex, men and women. It's a diversity in relation to the chosen people, Jew and Gentile. It's a diversity of culture, different nations and tribes and languages. We see the same thing in events in the history of the New Testament church. In Acts chapter 6, There were complaints by Hellenistic Jews against the Hebrew Jews in the Jerusalem church. The first group, the Hellenistic Jews, were probably made up of different colors because they were from various parts of diaspora Judaism all around the Mediterranean and also Western Asia. What separated them from the Hebrew Jews was not color, but language and culture. The church leaders solved the dispute by choosing 7 Greeks from Greek culture to deal with the needs of that Hellenistic, which also means Greek, community. One Greek culture, but different colors. Once again, the problem was culture, not color. And the solution that brought unity was to pay attention to culture rather than color. In John chapter 4, Jesus went out of his way to travel through Samaria, which by the first century held a people of different cultural and racial backgrounds from Jews in Jerusalem. Different from the Jews in Jerusalem. Samaritans are the descendants of were the descendants of marriages between Jews and pagans centuries back in the Assyrian Empire. Their religious cultus, their religion, was similar to that of Jews. They used Torah, but different. They had their own temple and priesthood and rejected the rest of the Old Testament. Jesus felt free to criticize their different culture. He said salvation is from the Jews, i.e., not the Samaritans, but leaped over social and religious barriers by talking to the Samaritan woman and by praising Samaritans for religious reasons. The only one of the 10 lepers who gave thanks was a Samaritan, and for moral reasons. Think of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritans were of a slightly different color, but color played no role in this significant cultural and religious confrontation. Jesus commended Naaman the Syrian general and the pagan widow at Zarephath in Luke 4 for their faith in God's word coming through Jewish prophets. Both were of slightly different color and ethnic background, but it was their cultural difference, not their color, that drew the attention of Jesus and the Bible writer. In Romans 14 and 15, Paul dealt with conflicts over Jewish practices. William S. Campbell, I highly recommend his book, it's called Paul and the Creation of Christian Identity, has persuasively argued that the church at Rome was mostly Gentile and inherited from the Roman Imperium prejudice against conquered Judea and its people. Despite the fact that some of its Gentile members were mentored by Jesus-believing Jews and took up Jewish practices while remaining Gentile, most of the Gentile membership despised both Jesus-believing Jews because of this prejudice they got from the Roman Imperium, and they also despised the Jewish practices of some of their fellow Gentiles. In chapters 14 and 15, Paul tells both factions to accept one another, both those who esteemed Jewish practices and those who despised them. Because this was Rome and attracted peoples from all over the empire, and because the Jews in the church there were also from around the empire, and thus from different nations and people groups, they were undoubtedly of different colors. But skin color did not play a role in this debate over Jewish versus Gentile identity in the letter to the Romans. The Bible talks about personal identity under 2 creations. The first is the old creation, whereby we know ourselves and others as men or women, Jews or Gentiles, parents or children, masters or slaves, whom God has put in particular nations and peoples and tribes with distinctive languages. All of us, believers and unbelievers, have been made in the image of God. That's the first creation. The other creation is the new creation that God has been forming for millennia, not just 2, but 3+, by joining people from the first creation to the Jewish Messiah Jesus by his Spirit. Paul said after his conversion on the Damascus Road, he no longer judged a man after the flesh. Great verse to keep in mind in this race debate. No longer do we judge a man after the flesh. That is, he no longer judged a person by categories from the old creation: sex, nation, people, tribe, language, or we might say today, skin color. And if we were to take a time capsule back today and ask Paul about skin color, he would say, "What? Why in the world would anyone judge another human being by something so superficial? You must be crazy. Even the worst pagans know that's ridiculous." No, all that mattered for Paul and the other apostles was whether they were in the new creation by faith and baptism. Their old creation distinctives were no longer barriers, Galatians 3:28. In Messiah, let's remind ourselves that's what Christ means, there is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male and female. It doesn't say or, it says and here, going back to Genesis 1 and 2. None of these distinctions could prevent a person with faith from being justified by the Messiah's work and spirit. Males and females, Greeks and Jews, slaves and free were justified in the same way by becoming one with the Jewish Messiah. Now, let us not make the mistake of thinking that the Messiah came to destroy the old creation's distinctions, as many Christians do. There are still the male-female distinctions, and thank God for that. And there are still the Jew-Gentile distinctions. After all, Paul said on Mars Hill that God had determined them. And they would remain in the church and in eternity as part of the beautiful divine diversity. For example, Paul made it clear that men and women still have different roles in marriage in the church. In Ephesians 5, in Colossians 3, in 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 14, 1 Timothy 2, and Titus 1. And national and cultural distinctions would be apparent even in heaven, we see from Revelation 7:9. Therefore, in the Bible, there are only two races, the old creation and the new creation. The King James translation really gets this right. Acts 17:26 describes the unity of the human race and the old creation. God hath made of one blood all nations of men, one blood, for to dwell on all the face of the earth. So the first creation is one, you might say, race, the human race. The other race on this planet is the new creation that is being formed by the triune God of Israel. Here, the work of God does not destroy the old creation's unity, but redeems it. Grace perfects nature through the preaching and the sacraments of the church. If anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. And our unity in creation is transformed into the image of the Messiah from one degree of glory to another, 2 Corinthians 5. Christians are in both creations, the old and the new. They are in the old as human beings made in the image of God, and they're in the new because they're being remade into the image of the Messiah. In all of his profound treatments of the two creations, two races, if you will, there is not one word in the Bible that clearly identifies a person by skin color. Now, this is true even in the event most often thought to refer to skin color, the conscription of Simon the Cyrene to help Jesus carry his cross. Many of those in Cyrene were probably brown North Africans, but Cyrene also was home to 100,000 Jews who might have come originally from Egypt, since the Ptolemies had subdued Cyrene. And those Jews might have come from all over the Roman world, as we see them cataloged in Acts 2, with many different ethnicities and colors. So even in this instance, where in the New Testament we get closest to guessing the skin color of a major character, we're not sure. And the Bible doesn't even try to help us. So the Word of God is not concerned about skin color. Perhaps it's suggesting in its own oblique way that the best way to fight racism in this country, as in all countries, is to stop obsessing about skin color, to recognize people as amazing creatures made in the image of God, each of whom is wonderfully unique, and then to be grateful that so many have been lifted up into the new creation. This is how we Christians and Anglicans should urge those within the church and outside the church to begin thinking about race. This is how we should think of others, not noticing them by and labeling by their skin colors, but regarding them as unique individuals in the first creation and some as also in the new creation. After all, this way of thinking about people as full of God-given gifts and skills and as coming from a huge variety of tongues and tribes and peoples and nations is the true kingdom diversity which does not pay attention to skin color. This is the rich and beautiful divine diversity in comparison. The world's diversity that is fixated on skin color and gonads and sexual attraction is superficial and, I have to say it, boring. Thank you.
Even after what I said last night, you invited me back, and now you're going to regret it. We're about to go to law school. This is much more in my wheelhouse, by the way. I'm much happier talking about justice than about critical theories. I'm going to try not to be boring. So I'm not going to talk about race. I'm going to talk about justice. And I'm going to talk about justice because I think Americans want justice. Our young people march around demanding it. Politicians promise to deliver it. We pledge allegiance to a flag that symbolizes a republic which provides what? Liberty and justice for all. At school, at work, at political protests, at the polls, on the internet, in the movies, and on the news, justice is the first and most urgent priority. We see messages about justice everywhere now. When we ride a bus, turn on the television, drop off our kids at school, or buy camping gear for a trip. Justice even pervades our leisure time. The National Football League and the National Basketball Association celebrate players less for their achievements on the court or the field, but more for promoting change and making justice. Symphony orchestras now have staff members whose job it is to promote equity and justice. At times it may even seem we worship justice. The United States government has an entire department of justice. Note well, not an office of the Attorney General, a department of justice. And where do its lawyers go to work? Same place all other lawyers go to work. They go to work in temples with tall columns, whose foyers are sparingly adorned with the iconography of justice. Portraits and statues of great jurists, Lady Justice blindfolded holding her scales. The facades of these temples are adorned like the temples in ancient Greece with religious images. Moses displaying the Ten Commandments, mythic figures sitting in judgment. So we care a lot about justice, but what is it? That's the question, isn't it? Ask any 3 Americans what justice is, and you'll get 5 answers. So we seem to be divided by a common ideal. Well, let's try some of these on for size. We hear a lot about social justice, but it turns out that most versions of that idea are antisocial and unjust. Because the first thing they must do is divide us into tribes and assign approval or blame, not according to our choices and actions and deliberations, but according to our skin color, sex, religion, annual income, or geographic areas. And depending on who's adjudicating the social justice, some people turn out to be inherently unjust as a result of things they can't control. Being born in the wrong body or the wrong skin, the wrong family. We hear a lot about economic justice, racial justice, and environmental justice, but it seems like adding adjectives to justice doesn't get us any closer to it. Indeed, it seems to make the problem worse. If environmental justice requires the government to impose regulatory burdens on businesses in poor communities, to shut down coal mines and small manufacturing operations, for example, then it seems to conflict with economic justice, which requires us to give economic opportunities to those who most need them. If racial justice requires affirmative action policies that discriminate against certain racial minorities, say Asians in the University of California university system, in favor of other racial minorities, then justice eats its own tail. What do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now. Where do we find it? I don't know. It seems like no matter how we pursue justice, what we end up with is one group for whom the particular claim of justice requires perpetrating an injustice against some other group. So it's difficult to avoid the inference that justice simply means what I want. And increasingly, we all want different things. In fact, we seem to have mutually incompatible goals. Justice means so many different and inconsistent things that it seems to mean maybe nothing at all. We can't seem to get by without it, though, so what do we do for it? Well, I'm going to take a turn here. Again, I'm going to be uncharacteristically optimistic. We can recover an understanding of what justice is. And the good news is it's right here in our own tradition, the Christian tradition. Like gravity, justice is not a matter of personal opinion or subjective preference. Like beauty, justice is difficult to define precisely, but also universal and rationally desirable for its own sake, in and of itself. Like other virtues, justice does not always emerge to view right away, but it always fulfills us when we achieve it. It enables humans to flourish. Justice is rational, then. Justice is good, and it is good for everyone, whether they happen to want it or not, whether they agree with it or not. Furthermore, we can achieve justice. We've done it before. We abolished slavery throughout Christendom, twice. We won civil rights for racial minorities, twice. And we defeated totalitarian regimes in Europe, twice. We can do it again. But to achieve justice, we must first understand what it is. We can follow those who abolished slavery in the 6th through 11th centuries and those who re-abolished slavery in the 19th. Those who led the victorious movements for civil rights in the 1860s and again in the 1960s, and those who defeated first the Nazis and then the Soviet Union, but only if we go back to the original sources from which they drew their intellectual resources and moral resolve. So let's start with a working definition. It's arguably the most important and influential definition of justice in human history. The authors of this definition did not themselves abolish slavery, but their writings provided the justification and motivation for those who did abolish slavery. The authors of this definition did not extend religious liberty, free speech, or due process of law to all human beings, but the rights and duties that they described and they articulated and the institutions of law that they set down on paper provided the foundation later centuries for civil liberties, due process, equal protection of the laws, and the rule of law throughout the Western Hemisphere. The authors of this definition of justice crafted the raw materials from which many of the great achievements of justice have been built, such as the Declaration of Independence, the Northwest Territories Act, the writings and speeches of Frederick Douglass, which, by the way, by derivative, have actually now been instantiated in other parts of the world as well. The authors that I'm referring to were the jurists of the 6th century Christian emperor Justinian. The books they wrote, collectively known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, became the definitive treatises on justice throughout Christendom and later throughout the world. The world's first university, the University of Bologna, was founded for the express purpose of teaching and studying the Corpus Juris Civilis after it was rediscovered. And for many centuries, really from the 11th century until just the day before yesterday, every law student in the Western Hemisphere would have begun their studies by reading Justinian's Institutes. Every great judge quoted them. They framed the conceptual categories that eventually gave us the rule of law. The Institutes and the Digest of Justinian made it possible to think about equal justice under the rule of law, and so they made it possible to achieve equal justice under the rule of law. Because law can have objective meaning, it can stand above the powerful, even above the sovereign. Because law can stand above the sovereign, the law is not merely the sovereign's commands and prohibitions. The most powerful men can be subject to the law, and it is possible even to have human rights, which are not contingent on the will of the sovereign, do not change with the shifting fortunes of war and politics, and can belong to all human beings. All of that's only possible if law is something other than sovereign will. So because of Justinian's juris, we can deny that might makes right, and we can explain in detail how justice makes right. The jurists obviously thought that justice is important, so they oriented their entire account throughout the Institutes and the Digest toward justice. So the Institutes opens with this definition. Here it is. Justice, justitia, is the set and constant purpose which gives to everyone what he is due as a matter of right. Jus suum cuique. Now, a lot is packed into that sentence, so I want to spend a minute unpacking it. First of all, notice that Justinian's jurists take it for granted that justice is the point of the law. You want to study law? You start with justice. Today, most ruling elites think that the point of law is something like social engineering, and the highest and best study of is legislation or economics or sociology. Too many lawyers assume that the point of law is to achieve the best results for one's client, and law is basically procedure. Many activists and a growing number of officials and educators insist that the point of law is equality of outcome. In that case, we should just dispense with the artificial distinctions of law altogether and study systems of power and inequality and distribution instead. But that's not what the jurists think. They think that we can understand the law that we have if we assume that the point of law is not winning or perfecting the human condition or achieving equality of result. For nearly all of Western legal history, legal education and practice began with the proposition that the point of law is to achieve justice. And the lawyers and jurists who shaped the law acted on the understanding that the entire point of their decisions and actions was to achieve justice. And they built the law toward that end. So to understand the law, we need to understand justice, and to understand justice, we need to study law. Second, Justinian's jurists define justice as a disposition, a way of interacting with other people in the world. They say justice is the set and constant purpose to do something. Justice is not a state of affairs out there in the world. It's not something to achieve out there. It's rather a disposition or attitude or continual intention that is interior to an acting person. Justice is, in the words of the great tradition, a virtue. Justice is something that must be in me and must drive and motivate my choosing and intending and acting. And that's the good news, because that's the one thing I can actually control. So justice is not about getting the best possible results for my client or my race or my gender or my religious group or my political party. The result that my client or tribe wants is not always the just result. Nor is justice primarily about engineering society, making the world conform to my desires or opinions. Justice is instead a virtue. It must begin and reside in me, shaping me to conform to what justice requires. Third, justice is not dependent upon outcomes or consequences, nor does it depend on my particular circumstances. I can be just toward other people, whether I'm rich or poor, comfortable or uncomfortable, even when other people are unjust toward me. If someone defames me, for example, I can still speak truthfully and charitably about them, or at least say nothing in return. Nor is justice about equality of result, what we today call social justice. The jurists tell us that the virtue of justice is a disposition to give to everyone, to each what is due or owed. And we owe different people different things. What is due to a person differs according to who they are, what they do, and sometimes on where they're from or where they happen to be located. I owe more to my own children than to other children. I owe honor to someone who acts courageously and dishonor to a con man who steals life savings from little old ladies. Therefore, to insist that everyone be treated the same is a kind of injustice. To achieve perfect equality of outcome requires us to do away with all discrimination, which is another way to say thinking, which makes it impossible to reason practically about our real differences, which matter as a matter of justice. If justice is not about outcomes, then what is the point? The point, they say, fourth and finally, is to give or render, to bestow to every person what he or she is due as a matter of right. And here you need to look at the Latin. I'm not a Latin scholar, but even I can see this. In the original Latin, the term for right, jus suum cuique, and the term for law or justice, justitia, have the same root, jus. The right and the just are the same thing. Right, just, law, all the same word, because they're all the same concept. This is a radically different way of thinking about rights than we have today. Today, when we speak of rights, they tend to mean personal claims or entitlements. The first-person perspective of a right today is the point of view of the person who believes he's owed something. Notice, that's not the perspective of the institutes. The perspective of Justinian's jurists is the other way around. The point of view of rights is the same as the point of view of justice. It is the point of view of the acting person, the person who owes something to someone else. The first-person perspective of a right just is to do what is just toward the person standing before me. Rights are justice, which concerns what is right to do, and by derivation, injustice is what is wrong to do. And this was the perspective of the entire legal tradition throughout Europe, England, and America, and all the other former English colonies right up until the day before yesterday. I've included on your handout a very short list of quotes. Could have been about 100 pages longer. They would all teach you the exact same thing. Notice every single one of these takes the perspective not of the right bearer, but of the duty bearer, the person whose job it is to do right by someone. Thomas Aquinas, the most important philosopher to write about justice, took his definition of justice from Justinian. William Blackstone, the great English jurist whose commentaries on the laws of England has more than any other written work influenced American legal doctrine since it was first published in 1765, defined law as that which requires us to do what is right and forbids us to do what is wrong. By the way, this is the answer to the integralists. John Locke was not the most important intellectual influence on the American founders. The King James Bible and William Blackstone were in that order. American jurists from John Adams, James Wilson, Joseph Story, James Kent, and Abraham Lincoln all accepted this understanding of justice as obviously true, as did all judges on all levels of the bench. Every one of those jurists identified rights as the right thing to do, what is right in our dealings with other persons. So if you want to understand fundamental rights in our legal tradition, you must stop thinking about rights as entitlements. Rights are directed at what we owe to others, not what others owe to us. Rights direct our own actions and our own attitudes. They point us to the equal dignity and different properties of other human beings. That is what justice is. And Christians affirm this shared understanding of justice right up until the day before yesterday, as I said. So to do justly by each person, I must know what each person is owed, and to know that, I must know what each person is and what each person has done. I only have less than 2 minutes left, so I can't get in detail into that ultimate question, but I think ultimately that is the question. What does it mean to be an acting human being in relation with other human beings? That's the perspective to which the classical Christian tradition of justice calls our attention. A human being is not her identity, her feelings, her ambitions, his fears, his appetites, nor is a human being merely a product of his culture, language, religion, or discursive regimes. Justice requires attention to both the particular and the general, but it requires us to pay attention to what makes a human being human. Justice requires attention to the particular choices and actions of the person first, second to their talents and abilities, and third to their circumstances. But ultimately, justice is for persons. And persons, as we know, have a shared nature. The natural person, who is embodied, inspirited as an animal, and rationally ensouled, is a reason for action in and of herself, never instrumentally to be exploited for our own purposes. That's the point to which the classical understanding of justice calls our attention. Justice is owed to each and every human being whom I encounter throughout my entire life. And the point of justice is that I will possess the virtue of justice so that when I encounter her, I will know how rightly to act toward her. Thank you.